friends. On behalf of Faculty of Legal Studies and on behalf of Faculty of Social Sciences, I welcome all of you to this very special lecture on conflict between religious freedom and discrimination in Western legal systems, which will be delivered by Professor Carolyn. We are indeed delighted to have you here, Professor Evans, and I welcome you on behalf of South Asian University. I'll now request Professor Sasanka Pereira, the Dean of Faculty of Social Sciences, to kindly introduce the speaker and to conduct the proceedings. Thank you.
Okay, good evening. I must apologize that there aren't as many people as there are seats, but then we have this mega conference going on downstairs with stars like the former Prime Minister and so on taking part. So, these things happen. But anyhow, when Professor Tyagi asked me whether we would be able to co-sponsor this event, Legal Studies and Social Sciences, obviously I had no hesitation, simply because this is a very interesting topic for both faculties. To very briefly introduce Professor Evans, she is the Dean and also the Harrison Moore Professor of Law at Melbourne Law School in University of Melbourne, and she has been in this position since 2011. She completed her PhD at University of Oxford in 2000, and looking through your CV, it seems to me that you have been at Melbourne University quite a bit of your academic life. She became a barrister and a solicitor of the Supreme Court of Victoria in 1995. She is the author of Freedom of Religion under the European Convention on Human Rights, published by Oxford University Press in 2001. In 2008, she co-edited with Kane and Robinson, Law and Religion in Theoretical and Historical Context, which was published by Cambridge University Press. She co-wrote with S.C. Evans, Australian Bill of Rights, the Law of the Victorian Charter and the ACT Human Rights Act, which was published in 2008. She also edited with Whiting, Mixed Blessings, Laws, Religions and Women's Rights in the Asia-Pacific region, which was published in 2006. And of course, there's a whole range of publications to her credit, which I'm not going to go into today, mostly due to lack of time. So what I will do is invite Professor Carolyn Evans to begin her lecture now. How much time do we have?
40 minutes, 35 or so.
There you go. So please, you can either talk from there or from here.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the people who are here today. I'm, in fact, delighted that so many of you could come here at such short notice. And part of what I'm doing here in India is to try and foster stronger and better relationships between law schools and indeed scholars more generally from Australia and from India. I think we have a lot that we can learn from each other. Certainly last time I was here in Delhi talking on some of my research in this area, I absolutely horrified my colleagues from India at the things that I was saying, and they said, no, this is terrible, this would never work in this country, and explained why. And it really got me thinking a lot more deeply about the topic than I had before. If you'll excuse me for a brief advertisement, I've left some material about Melbourne Law School at the front here, our JD program and our Masters of Law program, just in case you or a friend or a family member might have some interest. Melbourne Law School is Australia's leading law school and regularly ranked in the top 10 law schools in the world. We've had some fantastic students from India come in the past, and we'd certainly be delighted to have some more in the future. So today I'd like to talk to you about the tension that evolving in the legal system between religious freedom and the rights, particularly of autonomous religious bodies, and non-discrimination or equality law. And I know some of you are lawyers and some of you are not. This is a slightly law-y topic, but I'll try and give it a slightly more general twist as well. I'm going to talk about Western legal systems, Australia, European, North American in particular. It's what I know, but I think some very interesting things are happening here in India. I think it's always a bit obnoxious for somebody to come from overseas and tell you about your own country, so instead I hope we perhaps have a chance to have a little bit of discussion. I think that some of these things that I'm talking about play out in a very, very different way in this country, where even the structure and the type of religious experience here is so different. But in a lot of the systems that I'm used to and I'm talking about, we've seen quite substantial change over recent decades in the comparative weight that those societies give to religion or religious freedom as compared to equality and discrimination. Now, they have of course paid lip service to both for a very long time, but I think we all know that while we might have celebrated the equality of man with an emphasis on man part for a long time in a number of constitutions and legal systems, it's really only been in recent decades that we've really started to come to grips with some of the issues around things like racial discrimination, sex discrimination, and even much more recently issues around, for example, disability discrimination or sexuality discrimination. So they've started to come to some real prominence in the last few decades, and they've taken on a fairly substantial normative status in these countries. In a country like my own, now, while they were fiercely contested when there were laws that were brought in to protect people against discrimination, very fiercely contested, particularly by religious groups, now they're pretty well accepted, including by a lot of religious people. On the other hand, say if we go back 40, 50 years ago, religion was a very important and strong part of most of these societies. It was often contested in various ways, but the overwhelming majority of people in most Western countries describe themselves as religious, the overwhelming majority describe themselves as some form of Christian, and the overwhelming majority saw religion as a source of good, of some kind. That a society was better if a lot of the people in it were religious. Now again, this is changing dramatically. The level of religiosity in most of those countries is declining. The United States is it's still declining, but not in quite the same way. And the United States is the exception, largely because of its migration policies. So the number of people who are religious has gone down. The number of people who describe themselves as Christian, as a percentage of those who are religious, has decreased. And the number of people who are hostile to, suspicious of, cynical about the role of religion has increased. There are many more people who see religion as socially harmful, as damaging, or as threatening. So we're in a bit of an in-between period. Non-discrimination is starting to get fairly widespread social support, but not absolute social support, and I'll come back to that. At the same time, we're not sure as a society what we think of religion. Or many of the Western societies are really not sure about the role and place of religion in society. And we're also starting to struggle with very modest forms of pluralism. Now, from an Indian point of view, you know, the level of pluralism in most Western countries is sort of laughably modest compared to what you've been dealing with so successfully for such a long time. But for us, it's something that's a bit new and a bit confronting. Now, one of the places that this plays out is in the workplace. Religions are big employers in a lot of countries. You might think of the people being as employees of religion as being priests and monks and rabbis and muftis and so forth. That's a really tiny percentage of the people who are employed by religions. A huge percentage of those people who are employed work in Catholic hospitals, work in Muslim aged care facilities, work in social services, old people's homes, In countries like Australia, the United States, and a number of the countries of Europe, these are very, very large providers of social services. The Catholic Church is in the top 5 employers in terms of the sheer number of people employed of all employers, government and private, in Australia. Now, the difficulty that arises here is that in undertaking these tasks as employers, most religious groups don't see themselves just as any old employer. They don't just set up a hospital to make money, for example, as a private provider might do. They see what they're doing in the community and the society as being around their religious mission. That they are providing assistance and help for those who most need it, and they're providing it in accordance with their values, their beliefs, and their moral structures. And many of them therefore argue that as employers and as providers of these services, they shouldn't be bound by some of the same laws that would, for example, other providers or government providers might have to be, particularly in terms of issues like discrimination. So they might say we should be allowed to discriminate in favour of our co-religionists. If I'm a Catholic school, I should be able to discriminate in favour of Catholic teachers or Christian teachers. Maybe not every single teacher, but I should be able to give preference to a co-religionist. They might say there are certain sorts of jobs we don't think women should do. We belong to an evangelical church that says women shouldn't have leadership positions in an organisation, so none of our leadership roles should go to women. They might say we should be able to sack employees who don't comply with the sexual morality that is required of our religion. And if we can't do this, we won't be being authentically religious. We won't be properly acting out our values. In fact, you might, if you force us to do otherwise, you might force us to act against our values. And that's a breach of our religious freedom. Now, on the other side of the debate, as you can imagine, a group of people saying, well, it's fine to talk about your autonomy and your religious freedom, but you're huge employers. You employ tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people across these different countries. And on the whole, religions have been really bad when it comes to issues of equality. I think of women's equality across a whole range of world religions, and in fact, religions that aren't world religions. You regularly see at the forefront of those justifying inequality and justifying discrimination of being religions. So those are coming at this from a non-discrimination or equality point of view say, we can't give you a pass. We can't say that you simply get to avoid these laws while all other employers have to comply with them. That's unfair. It undermines the rights of individuals who are employees or potential employees. It undermines the system of non-discrimination. It undermines the important symbolic commitment to non-discrimination that governments make. Legal systems then have to try and come up with some sort of coherent way of dealing with this. On both sides you have rights arguments. So it's not enough to say, those of you who study law might be aware of the work of Ronald Dworkin, the notion of rights as trumps. That if you've got a rights argument, or the rights argument wins against the economic argument, or the political argument, or the convenience or efficiency argument. But of course it doesn't tell you what happens when you have two trumps. What happens when you've got a right to religious freedom, one group of people saying, I have to live in compliance with the beliefs of my religion, and another human right of equality, somebody saying, well, I'm being discriminated against so that you can live in compliance with the rights of your religion. I identified 4 broad approaches that Western legal systems have taken to this issue. Briefly, the first is what I call an ordinary law approach. Don't care if you're religion, you just have the same rules as everybody else. The second is an exceptionalism approach. We're going to carve out an area where the law doesn't touch religions. The third is a procedural fairness approach. You can have whatever substantive rules you like as a religion, but you must go through due process if you want to enforce them. And the final one is a rights balancing approach. We're going to look at every individual case on its merits and weigh and balance. Just want to go through those briefly. I don't for those of you who are not lawyers, I don't want to get too bogged down in the technical details, but they show up some of the strengths and the weaknesses of the different positions. So the first one, the ordinary law approach. Now generally, we in fact do expect religious people and religions to obey the law. We don't allow religions to stone people to death for blasphemy. We don't allow them to build unsafe buildings that could fall down and cause problems. Generally we say, we don't care if you're religious, you still have to obey the same laws. And there's an argument to say, well, that's simply what we should do in the employment area as well. Non-discrimination is important. We should simply require religious employers not to discriminate. And there would still probably be some room there for a little bit of flexibility, because most non-discrimination laws have a provision in them that says if it's a genuine occupational requirement, or some language like that, it's what we use in Australia, you can discriminate. If you really need a man to do this job, if you really need someone of a particular religion to do this job. The classic example might be if you're casting Romeo and Juliet, you can have a man play Romeo and a woman play Juliet. That's not discrimination, that's something you actually really need for the job to be done properly. But where the boundaries of what's really required are, that becomes a little bit more difficult. If you're working in a women's clothing shop, do you have to be a woman, or is it just useful? Tricky things there. So there would still be a possibility for religions to say there is a genuine occupational requirement that we be allowed to discriminate, but they'd need to make the case and potentially make it to the courts. So you could see, for example, an easy case to make out that a Catholic priest really has to be Catholic. Right? It's not discrimination, that's really just part of the job. But it might be trickier to say that they have to be a man. Right? That's very much the teaching of the Catholic Church. Been teaching the Catholic Church for 2,000 years. Would the courts accept that argument? Because it's argument based around religious arguments. So this is why religious groups are very nervous about this sort of approach. Well, you know, we don't want the courts trying to work out what we really need as part of our religion or not. We want to keep that right for ourselves. So then a lot of religious organisations argue for the complete opposite, the exceptionalism approach. And the exceptionalism approach says, once you fall within this rule, once you are a religious employer, for example, then none of these ordinary laws apply. We don't care, we won't ask any questions, you just get out of jail free from the law. So the most well-known example of this is from the United States. There's a constitutional right to what's called a ministerial exception. So if a religious group can show that someone is a minister, then they can discriminate, they can unfairly dismiss that person, they can do all sorts of things that would normally not be lawful, as long as they can show the person's a minister. And the Supreme Court's taken a really, really broad definition of what a minister is in its ruling. So the leading case is a case called Hosanna Table. And in that case, the woman involved was a maths teacher at a religious school. So the overwhelming majority of the time, she was just an ordinary teacher doing ordinary teaching. But she also had a part of her role that was more religious, leading prayers, sometimes teaching some religion. And there were various other reasons the court decided she was a minister. So when she was sacked, and it's a little bit unclear exactly why she was sacked, but she may well have been sacked because she had a disability, had a sleep disorder. That would normally be completely illegal under American law, and the court said, we can't even look at that. We're not even going to go there because she's a minister. We just trust to the ordinary rules and regulations and so forth of the religion. And if there weren't any rules or regulations, a bit of bad luck. Now, as you can imagine, this rule for many religious groups looks like a really good one. It's clear, it's consistent, it's easy to apply, and it means they can basically run their organisations as they want to run their organisations. The difficulty is partly it's not very good for equality, and partly it allows a whole lot of behaviour that might have nothing to do with religion. Because the court won't look at these issues at all. So you can have been sacked maliciously, arbitrarily, You could have been sacked for reasons that have nothing to do with the religion or the religious values of the organisation. You could have been sacked because of a mistake. And it doesn't matter, the courts won't get involved at all. So the European Court of Human Rights then came up with the third possibility that was somewhere in between the two, and this is the procedural fairness approach. And in this approach, they say, look, the religion can work out its own rules, its own values, but then it has to be fair about the way it enforces them. So let's say that you are a school and you think, as in compliance with your religion, that none of the teachers should be involved in extramarital affairs. So this, you say, this is an important part of our religion. You can only be having sexual relationships with the person you're married to and nobody else. Well, the first thing they have to, the procedural fairness rule says that's fine. You can do that even though it would usually be discrimination. But the first thing you've got to do is make that rule clear. It has to be expressed. Staff need to know about it. And then, if you're going to apply it against them, you have to tell them why, and you have to give them a chance to defend themselves. To say, oh, no, that was a mistake. You know, the person you saw me kissing was my brother. I was just saying hello. There was no problem. So the European Court of Human Rights made this decision in a case called the Lombardi-Valori case, where a university teacher at a Catholic university was sacked after many decades because it was decided by the Vatican that some of the things he was teaching were, quote, against Christian teaching. But what things? They didn't say. Why they were against Christian teaching? They didn't say. He didn't get a chance to make a case. He didn't get a chance to defend himself. And the European Court of Human Rights said, well, this was a Catholic university, so it did have a right to make some rules and make some decisions about what was within bounds and without. But this was just unfair. It was procedurally unfair, not substantively, but procedurally. And they said, no, you've got to go back and at least give him a chance to defend himself. But over time, the European Court and the Australian courts take and certainly the Canadian courts take a similar approach, have come to more of a fourth area, the rights balancing approach, which says that there are serious and important issues at stake on both sides in these cases. It is important that religious people and religious organisations be able to live by their values and beliefs, but it's also important that individuals not be discriminated against, have some degree of protection, particularly for something as important as employment. So they say, well, you have to look in each individual case. How central was this to the religion? How important was it made clear to the person involved? What are the opportunities that that person would have to find other employment? Really quite a detailed look. And this can be seen looking at two cases that the European Court of Human Rights handed down on the same day, the Obst case and the Schuth case. They seem like quite similar cases. When you look at the facts, you think, oh, these look pretty similar, but the outcomes were completely different. So in the Obst case, you had a senior member of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon church that's sometimes known, had confessed to his superior that he had had an extramarital affair, and he was sacked. And the European Court of Human Rights said that was permissible. It looked at the way it was handled, it looked at the fact that the courts below had looked at the rights of this individual, but that the church had made it very clear what its teaching was on extramarital affairs and what the consequences would be if they were disregarded. There was no lack of mistake there. This person was a very senior person who represented the church in Europe. It was important that he be consistent, he be acting consistently with the values of his organisation. So they said that was fine. In the Schuth case, Mr. Schuth was an organist, played the organ at his local church. And it was discovered that he too was had had a relationship outside marriage. In that case though, the court said it was not fair when he was sacked and sent it back to the domestic court. In that case they said there was no consideration taken by the local courts of Mr. Schuth's circumstances. For example, the fact that he played the organ for a living. There are not many jobs playing the organ for a living, and they're almost all in churches. His age, all sorts of things. The courts had just disregarded him entirely and only looked at the rights of the church. And the European Court said, no, you've got to go back, you've got to take both seriously into account. We're not going to tell you what the outcome should be, because that's a matter of weighing and balancing, but domestic courts have an international human rights obligation to consider the full range of options. Now that approach, I think, is the most consistent with international human rights law. International human rights laws say all human rights are important, they're indivisible, they don't come in a hierarchy. If you've got two rights that are conflicting with each other, you should take them into account, each into account seriously. The downside with that last case, the last way of dealing with it, is that it can be very unclear, inconsistent. It's hard for an employee to know what their rights are in certain circumstances. It's hard for an employer to know what their obligations are. Now, at one level, this might be good. It might encourage people to be a bit more reasonable with one another, perhaps to come to negotiated solutions, to be more open to having discussions before things get to court. That might be a good outcome. But it could simply all be a little bit too chaotic and difficult. And one of the things that then becomes very important is the perspective of the judge. Is the judge someone who's sympathetic to religion generally, or to this religion in particular? Is it somebody who's hostile to religion generally, or to this religion in particular? Is it someone who puts a really high value on equality and non-discrimination, or somebody who perhaps puts more high value on autonomy and religious freedom? And so while I have a lot of sympathy for the fourth approach as potentially the best approach, I don't want to say it's without its problems or without its flaws. And that's particularly so, coming back to where I started, because we are in such a time of flux in most Western countries about the role of religion and the role of non-discrimination. We have a commitment to both, but we're not sure what that commitment is or how it plays out. I think these circumstances are quite different in a country like India, and I hope perhaps now that I've come to the end of my formal presentation, we might have a chance to have some discussions or questions about that. Thank you.
We'll now have some discussions since Professor Carolyn is not here, so I'll moderate the discussions.
Professor, once again you can take a seat, and so what we'll do, we'll collect 2 to 3 questions, and then maybe, any questions, any comments that anybody has, please, you're most welcome to ask, raise your questions or comments. You need somebody to start. Yes, sure.
A priori, religious freedom and legal aspects, they are mutually exclusive. How does the legal system get into discussing a religious freedom? It is like asking, science and religion. Faith does not demand logic. Similarly, scientists say that we do this, there is no question of answering why you are doing it. So this contradiction I don't understand.
It's always a very difficult situation when law and religion get intersected. Law gets involved with everything. That's one of the things law does. It colonises all space. We get involved with science, we get involved with religion, we get involved with philosophy. It doesn't mean we do it well, but we always get involved with it. Different legal systems have taken different approaches to this. You're right, faith is not, at least many faiths, are not a matter of logic or reason or those sorts of things. They come from a different place. What the law needs to do, though, is to work out when different groups within a society are motivated in these ways, how do we still have a society that works together in a reasonably coherent way that doesn't simply devolve, as many societies have over time, into religious wars, into widespread discrimination or oppression of minorities by majorities. So those are sort of questions that law, I think, can and must answer. And I think one of the reasons that these issues have come up in a number of Western legal systems is because we've dealt with them so badly outside law. that have led to wars, they have led to persecutions, they have led to torture and all sorts of awful things in Europe in particular. That's why the United States was in part so keen to have the law involved with religious issues right from the start. Where I think the law needs to be very reluctant to go, although it does in a number of countries, is into whether this religion is right or this is wrong, or whether this is, let's say, with the case of the organist I was talking about, who he was divorced, so in Catholic Church teaching he's not supposed to remarry except under very limited circumstances. Court took into account a whole bunch of reasonable things, but at one point really it said you just can't expect somebody to do that. That's not sort of a fair way to get someone to live. Now, I don't think courts should get into that. There are a whole range of different values and value systems. There are a whole range of religious laws. I think the secular courts should stay out of those value judgments. But what they might say is, look, Catholic Church, we don't care how sincerely you believe this. We know that these are your rules. We know that these are your values. Nonetheless, it's not fair in this case to impose them on this person because there are other values in our legal system that take priority.
Any more questions? Yeah.
My question is, what are your views on abortion rights vis-a-vis in relation to religious freedom? Looking at the US legal system, the law is anti-abortion rights and is becoming more coercive in terms of reproductive rights.
Thank you. A nice, easy question. So there are a couple of issues here. One is the extent to which the law can or should reflect the religious values of some or all of its population. Now, to some extent, law does reflect the values of the population. So if your population becomes more conservative in various ways, the laws will probably become more conservative too. If the population becomes more liberal, the laws will probably become more liberal. That's unproblematic up to a point. And I suppose one of the things human rights tries to do is say, well, there are certain things that are not on the table. And it's, of course, a very controversial question as to whether abortion is one of those or not. Within that particular debate, there's the general question about, should you be creating laws that make it impossible for women to have abortion in all or many circumstances? And I do have some real concerns about where a fairly small section of the United States population is driving the laws in that regard. I think there's been an undue influence of a smallish religious minority. And then you've got the question of whether you should have some sorts of conscientious objection or allowance for religious people who don't themselves want to be directly involved in abortion. For that, I must admit, I have more sympathy. In some cases, that makes it almost impossible for women to have abortion. So that's I suppose, where you get to the weighing and balancing element again. But one of the things that we're seeing from the United States, and for those of you who are IR people, I'm sure you've noticed it globally as well, there's a very highly organised, politically conservative, religiously motivated group, and their tactics and their way of influencing public opinion is being exported to countries like Australia. It doesn't work as well in countries like Australia because we're much less ideological about these things, but you see the sort of tactics that start in the US are then being spread across other countries as well, including with respect to the question of
Yeah, Ramani and then.
My name is Ramani. Well, I think by religious freedom, I think you're referring to Article 1, Amendment 1 of the US Constitution, which talks about the free exercise clause. But I think under the same amendment is the establishment clause, which also, indirectly allows the states money to go into religious activities. though it says that the state shall not support anything, but then the state also has its own ways of, addressing the religious issues of its population. Like, for example, it can also talk about sending religious services to your troops. So therein it's again talking about discrimination provisions. So I was just wondering, how do we address this conflict between the free exercise clause and the establishment clause coming in from the same amendment? Thank you.
My question is with regard to in terms of looking at non-discrimination laws vis-a-vis the freedom of religion, non-discrimination and freedom of religion. It somewhere I think misses the whole argument with regard to minority rights part of it. Can we equate a minority religion, majority religion, and apply the non-discrimination laws on par with each other in the sense that I think somewhere the minority element has to be taken into consideration when we talk in terms of non-discrimination, because the non-discrimination law has to take into consideration the minority element part of it, where it cannot be equated. I think that is the major problem with Wales and other things happening in France and other things. So how that really has to be reconciled.
Professor, thank you for your presentation. I have a question on a rather general question. It's often said that religion is a much stronger form of social control than law. And you yourself said that the church has failed in this regard. At least I strongly believe that the church has failed, not the Catholic Church, but the church as a whole. If you look from the time of the Inquisition to the present day, even if the church has had a voice, I think it has not been reflected in the foreign policy of the state or the actions of the state outside their country. I don't think the church anyway influences state's action, whether it is for a humanitarian cause or a conflict situation outside. I think there were times where I don't think a US president would say that I need to look at my Christian values, or I'm a Christian myself, or the Bible to see whether what I'm doing is right or wrong. And I think this is what is happening in the large part of the West. I wanted to know your views on this.
Thank you. Very interesting group of questions. So, the first question, I'd start by saying, in fact, I wasn't referring to the US Constitution, though the free practice and non-establishment clauses of the US Constitution come broadly into freedom of religion. I was more referring to, I suppose, the international protection of freedom of religion, and as the US has been an outlier in this regard, in separating out free practice and then non-establishment. The Australian Constitution, funnily enough, has almost exactly the same wording as the US Constitution on religious freedom and non-establishment, but it's been interpreted in a very different way, which in fact makes them a lot more easily consistent, which is the Australian has taken a very high threshold for establishment. So you can have a lot of funding of religious groups, engagement with religious groups and so forth, that it really has to reach the point where the state and the religion begin to be the same and coterminous. That's where you get a problem under the Australian law, and that means that almost nothing is an establishment. And free practice, the free exercise has also been interpreted to mean almost nothing, so our courts are not very good on rights in Australia. So yeah, there is, I think, always a tension between, at a more general level, between states helping to support groups and individuals to exercise their religious freedom, whether it's by helping to establish religious schools or clergy in the armed forces or whatever it might be, and where you get to the point where you go too far and tip over and start actually imposing religious practice on people. So, for example, I think most people are fairly comfortable with the notion that if people are in the armed forces, they're probably entitled to some spiritual guidance of whatever kind is most meaningful to them. That's not inherently problematic, and it's similar with prisons. If you put people in prison as a state and say, we're going to control who you can see, probably one of the people you're entitled to see is a minister or religious leader. That being said, if you look at the practice and reality of the role that some of the clergy have played in the US Armed Forces, it starts to get quite oppressive in terms of using rank to try and impose Christianity or certain Christian prayers and practices. So, I think it's a very difficult and delicate line, which is a bit of a non-answer to your question, but this is not exactly good. Minority rights, thank you for raising this. I've now only been in India for 20 hours, and this is the third time minority rights have been raised, so this is another good example of why it's always good to get out of your own country and talk to other people, because they help to remind you of different ways of looking at the world. This is interesting, this discussion is an interesting one from the point of view of minority rights. Because in a number of Western countries, one of the ways in which minority religious groups think they're being discriminated against is through the imposition of things like non-discrimination laws. So they say, well, we need to be authentically ourselves, and our culture, our religion, our way of expressing ourselves is not about treating everybody on the same footing. We have different roles for men and women in our society. We have different roles for people from different religious sects, whatever it might be. So some of them argue on the pluralist basis we shouldn't be covered by these laws because that interferes with the very small group of people in the society who are trying to authentically live with respect to their own religion. Now the difficulty can be some of those people also are the people most likely to be discriminated against by mainstream society in things like employment. So it can be a bit of a double-edged sword for those groups. And yes, I absolutely agree that there are other issues about the religious freedom of minority groups, raise issues like the veil in France and so forth, which are absolutely pressing. And I've written articles and books on, I just happen not to talk about them today, but please don't take that to mean that I don't care about them. And the final question, I think it is still true in some societies that religion is a more effective form of control than law, and laws really struggle against some entrenched religious perspectives in some societies. I think that is absolutely breaking down in Western societies. I think now it's the case for the vast majority that law is a much stronger form of social control than religion. That being said, religion can still exercise in particular areas some fairly substantial political influence. And again, it depends a lot on the culture of the country. I'm sure we've all heard the President of the United States saying, God bless you and God bless America. Which God? Who's God? I think we're actually all fairly clear about which God and who's God. In Australia, our Prime Minister said that. He said, God bless you and God bless Australia. And everyone, don't say that. That's just embarrassing. We don't talk about religion in Australia in that way. We don't want our politicians to talk about religion. But it's pretty hard to get elected in some parts of the United States without talking about religion. Now, you might talk about it a lot. You might not actually do all that much about it when you're actually there. But there are some areas that politicians who want to reach out to particular religious groups, and abortion was the example given before. If you want to get elected as a Republican, at least in certain parts, you better have a view on abortion that is consistent with a conservative Christian view on abortion. So I'd absolutely agree with you that the tide's turned between law and religion, but I don't think we should count religion out of the game yet. And I think both international lawyers and international relations scholars were too quick to assume that religion is something everybody would grow out of, and we'd all just be moving on to a highly rational contest of different types of needs and so forth. And I think the events of the last 10 to 20 years have shown us that religion is still actually a very potent force in international relations and can be in domestic legal systems.
Yes, Stelina first and then.
Thank you for the lecture. I have one question.
basically I see here two freedoms, right? Religious freedom and discrimination, not the principle of non-discrimination. And religious freedom, I suppose, in any parts of the world, it's definitely a very, very emotive issue. And if you look at the legal system, in fact, okay, more or less, in different degrees, obviously, different states has tried to look at the religious freedom. But mostly, obviously, whenever they have granted the freedom, it is regarding the internal matters of the religion. See, I don't think that there is any problem with anyone if the Roman Catholic Church says that, okay, women cannot be a priest. If a female demands, like, obviously that will be negated, saying that, okay, it's an internal matter of the church. But I think the problem comes when the religious establishment obviously come into the public sphere, whether it is a hospital or a school. I think, I was wondering that can't the legal system look at the purpose with which this, obviously, the establishment operates. For instance, like when a Catholic Church establishes a hospital, what is the purpose with? Is it the promotion of religious views? I don't think that, okay, establish such a charitable purpose. So the promotion of the religious values is not the primary motive of establishment of a hospital. So there definitely there is a problem that, okay, if a person obviously is admitted for an abortion where the Catholic values should not influence the decision of abortion, whereas the law obviously has to come into the picture. So I was wondering that can't we try to regulate the religious establishment by looking at the issue from the purpose of its establishment?
Yeah, we have one question.
Thank you for your nice presentation. I have actually two questions. The first question actually the ambiguity and ambivalence of USA legal system in terms of creation science and in terms of evolutionary science of human history. That is Darwinism, evolutionary history, and the creation science. Actually, there was a debate, but the USA legal system actually there is an ambiguity and ambivalence position in settling this debate. How USA legal system actually can settle this question without showing any ambivalence or ambiguity. This is my first question. And my second question actually about religious freedom. That means it recognizes the existence of religion, but we know there is a binary relationship between religion and secularism. If secularism means absent of religion, that means this does not recognize any religion. But religious freedom means it recognizes religion. So how we can settle this legal another ambiguity in terms of religion and secularism? Thank you.
We can take one more question before we turn to the advance. Any more questions on the side? We have one question.
Thank you, ma'am, for your presentation. It is more like a comment. When we talk about religion, we essentially have to look at the idea of secularism that exists in the world. I mean, in the West, the idea of secularism is that there should be complete separation and kind of principle of non-interference at all between the religious matters and the state. And when in this part of the world we talk about secularism, we see some form or the other an active role of the state in managing the affairs of various religions. Now, is it correct? Is it correct or right approach to separate religion at all, from the interference of the state? Because what may happen, as Stilna ma'am has also told, and it is happening that it may happen that in religion there may be matters of equality within the religion and the interreligious equality. So these are some aspects. If a state does not take into account or if it completely insulates itself from matters of religion, then within the religion itself there are instances of discrimination, and at the same time the issues of discrimination exist as between the different religions, like the issue of minority rights. So in this situation, is it not better that a state rather than being passive and following a principle of non-interference, at least it should maintain some principled distance and it should interfere wherever it is required to provide or to protect the basic civil rights of the persons, irrespective of their religion. Thank you.
Okay. So the first question was about the fact that it's relatively. Sorry, is that working? The first question was about whether it's not simple enough to try and distinguish between the private internal matters of the church, who gets to be a priest, what you have to do in order to be baptised or bar mitzvahed or whatever it might be. We might just keep that to the religions, and then once you come into the public sphere, we're in a different space, and then maybe we could use a purposes test. What's the purpose? I actually don't think the purposes test works. Because it is a bit of a matter of perspective. Religious groups will normally say they get involved in these areas precisely to live out their religious values. That they have hospitals, that they get involved in schools and so forth, in compliance with what they see as required of them from their religion, to help people, to help the poor, to educate, to assist the sick, that these are the sorts of things that are in compliance with their religion, and that's why they do that rather than open a restaurant or a clothing shop or any of the other things that they could do with their time. Now, from a secular point of view, you just say you run a hospital in order to cure people. It's not. That's the purpose of a hospital. Purpose is to help the sick. I think it can be quite difficult sometimes if you don't share the mindset to understand how thoroughly many religious people see everything they do as connected into their religion. So in some ways, the distinction that you started off by drawing is if we can we just limit religious freedom to the internal demands, the internal religious matters, I think might be simpler and more straightforward than using a purpose test. There was the question about creationism and Darwinism and the universal legal system. We don't really have a universal legal system. That's one of the problems. We have international law. It's not universal, really. It's not law often. And you said, could it avoid ambiguity and ambivalence? International law almost never avoids ambiguity or ambivalence. It's built on ambiguity and ambivalence, and the harder the issue is, the more ambivalent it becomes. So, I don't think there's some sort of easy international law answer to this. Other than to say, I don't think that religious freedom requires you to teach science as something other than science. And so if there is no scientific basis to a particular theory, story, or idea, I don't think religious freedom can or should demand that people in their science classes have to learn something that is frankly not science. It might be true, it might be what really happened by faith, and I'm not saying anyone should be prohibited from learning or understanding it, but I don't think international law requires that. The third question was religious freedom recognises religion, and how do you balance that with secularism? I actually don't think that that's a problem. Religious freedom is in many ways a creation of secularism at a level. It's what you do when you recognise that you have a social phenomenon that you have to deal with. It doesn't mean that any given religion is true or untrue. What you can recognise is that there are a lot of people who think that different religions are true, and they all need to live together, and preferably without trying to kill each other or hurt each other on a regular basis. So religious freedom and secularism are both answers to that question to some degree. Secularism, in most of its forms, is not about saying there should be no religion or denying religion. It's about a form of creating a government that isn't buying into a particular type of religion, to allow individuals and groups to operate freely in that society, to believe, to not believe, to change belief, and so forth. So I don't think the fact that religious freedom recognises religion is inherently problematic from that point of view. And finally, it was largely a comment, but I agree there are different conceptions of secularism, and whenever I teach this, I always say there's France and there's India, and there's sort of a spectrum in between. I have never, in fact, seen a state where the government is not involved in religion. The French government's involved in religion all the time, not necessarily in a very constructive way, but it gives money to certain historical churches, all happen to be Catholic, because of course historically that's what it was. It gets very involved in whether people should wear the veil or not. Now, it does that in the name of secularism, but in fact it's quite detailed regulation of people's religion. So, exactly how far a state's got to go in intervening in these matters, that's a really delicate and important matter. And the answer might be different in a country like like India, with its multiplicity of religions, with its history, with colonisation, with all of those issues might make the answer quite different there to the United Kingdom, to Japan. I don't think there's one answer. But I will say I don't think simplistic answers that just say the state can be over here and religion can be over here and they don't have anything to do with each other. It's just not realistic. So I've never actually seen a legal system or a political system where there is that complete separation, because you're dealing with human beings who are a mix of political, economic, religious, anti-religious, and so forth.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions if there are still one or two questions. Do we have? Yeah, we have one question.
Good afternoon. My question is religious freedom and discrimination. I mean, there is many practices, religious practices, which need scrutiny. When it comes to public sphere, then it needs state scrutiny. And there are many examples, told that there is a burqa ban in France. Recently, in the Supreme Court of India has held that polygamy is not the integral part of Islam. And there are, in Kolkata, there was Kolkata High Court has held that the use of loudspeaker is not permitted. And in Odisha, there was a religious procession which was threatening the public mind. That was also banned. So, what extent will amount the discrimination? There is if a law is enacted by the state and made by the court, then what laws will amount the discrimination? Any religious freedom should not go beyond, and there should be a litmus test, or it has to pass the minimum standard which won't hurt the other public mind.
Yeah. One final question.
Ma'am, my question is, I think, is a more fundamental one. At the time when it was said that law is above the king, why at that time it was not said law is above the church or religion? And I think the problem, this conflict between religious freedom and discrimination in on the legal systems arises from that question: why it was not said the law is above the church at the same time when it was said the law is above the king?
So two quite complicated questions to finish with. I'll give probably brief and unsatisfactory answers to both. The first is about the role of the judiciary, and again that I think differs from society to society depending on the makeup of the judiciary, their independence, the extent to which the executive and the legislature are playing their role properly in society. But I do think that there is a role for the judiciary in trying to act as a fair middle ground, a place at least where people have to make rational arguments on both sides in a court, on both sides of the argument, rather than through political lobbying or any of the day-to-day sort of areas of politics where minority groups might not get as fair a hearing as they do in a court. That being said, and I know the role of the judiciary in India is probably more proactive than it is in countries like my own. I'm not always sure that it's a healthy thing to leave too much controversial decision making up to judges. I'm not sure that they are the best people to make those types of decisions, and some of the sorts of issues around issues like polygamy or so forth, I'm really not clear on why judges, rather than democratic mechanisms, are best for utilising those. Just coming back to the abortion issue, there's a set of theories in constitutional law that the reason that this issue has continued to be so difficult in the United States was it was decided by judges rather than by the ballot box. And in countries like Australia and most parts of Europe where the issue was decided by the ballot box, where people just overwhelmingly made it clear that this was something that they wanted, it's actually not a huge issue anymore. Whereas in the United States, the democratic process sort of cut across by judges. I think that can be a problem. With the question, was the law above the king, was it? Law, I think that's partly a matter of historical context. The church at the time had its own laws and its own set of regulations which they weren't above, but there was sort of an uneasy dual relationship between the king, between the secular system and the religious system. God was clearly above the law, but that didn't mean that the church was always above the law. Whatever the church might have said about its relationship to God, I think it was a little bit more complex than that. And really a big part of the Enlightenment project was making clear that the church, and possibly God, were under law. So I think we've actually, that was hardly the final word on that.
Well, thank you so much. It has been a very exciting last 1 hour 15 minutes listening to you, and I think we all have benefited immensely from a very stimulating lecture. Before we end this program, on behalf of South Asian University, I would request 2 of our students to present a small memento to you, thanking you for coming to South Asian University, taking time off and speaking to us.
So thank you. They're very, very hard questions for someone who still has jet lag. But I found it very interesting and enjoyable. And please do feel free to help yourself with some brochures about Melbourne University.
And we wish you a pleasant stay in India, and we hope that you will visit us again. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for turning up. Please help yourself with some tea served outside the hall. Thank you.